I thought losing my job and moving into my grandpa's old cabin was rock bottom until the HOA president taped a no-access sign across the only bridge in apparently I now live in a gated community I didn't sign up for, and the gate is a retired HR manager with a citation fetish. She fined me for everything from lawn gnome placement to unapproved wildflower varieties. It was like getting a performance review from someone who'd never left the corporate office. But here's the thing, while they were busy enforcing their precious bylaws, they forgot one small detail. Before we continue, tell us where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful content like this. Let's just say the bridge they blocked wasn't theirs to begin with, and once I dusted off some old property surveys, the HOA was about to get a master class in what real boundary lines look like. The whole disaster started 3 months after I was laid off from my job as a land surveyor in the city. I'd spent a decade mapping out complex properties for a large engineering firm. But when the company downsized, my entire department was eliminated. My severance was draining fast, my lease was up, and the small cabin I'd inherited from my grandfather felt like the only sanctuary I had left. The place was tucked away on the edge of a small lake in a rural area that had recently been developed into a community called Whispering Pines. About 40 homes had popped up around the lake. In the last decade, my grandfather had owned his plot of land since the 1960s, long before any homeowners association had ever been imagined. As I sat there staring at the new metal gate, a woman in a perfectly pressed pantsuit approached my truck. She had a sleek silver bob that looked like it required daily maintenance, and she carried a tablet like a weapon. Her name was Brenda Reynolds, and everything about her screamed middle management. "Pardon me," she said, her voice smooth but firm as I lowered my window. "I'm Brenda Reynolds, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. You can't leave your vehicle here. This access road is now under HOA jurisdiction, and unauthorized parking is a violation of community covenants." Her tone was the kind managers use when they're about to explain a new policy that everyone's going to hate. I tried to be polite, explaining that I was Alex Carter, that my grandfather had owned the cabin across the bridge, and that I was his sole heir. I showed her the deed from my glove compartment and the property tax bill that came to my city address. Brenda barely glanced at them before launching into a well-rehearsed speech about community cohesiveness and procedural integrity. "Mr. Carter," she said, tapping her tablet with a perfectly manicured finger, "I spent 25 years in human resources, so I understand how organizations work. Property ownership doesn't supersede community regulations. This bridge and its access road serve the entire community, and we have protocols." She pulled out a small portable printer from her oversized handbag and printed a citation. "Your garden gnome is also in violation of Section 7BI of the Aesthetic Code. Community guidelines prohibit decorative statuary that is not part of an approved landscape design." I looked at the small weathered gnome my grandpa had placed by his front door 30 years ago, then at the massive bronze dolphin fountain in front of the community's entrance gate. The logic was dizzying, but I didn't want to make waves on my first day. I took the citation and asked where I could find a copy of the HOA rules. Brenda smiled a thin, practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "All registered residents receive a digital copy of the handbook upon completing the orientation process. Since your grandfather never registered the property, you'll need to submit a full application to the board. She handed me a business card with a QR code on it after she left. I spent the evening scrolling through the 200-page digital handbook. The regulations were mind-numbingly specific, from the approved shades of beige for exterior paint to the maximum allowable height for swing sets. What struck me was how many rules seemed designed to give Brenda and her board absolute discretionary power. There were fines for everything from visible trash cans to having the wrong species of flowers in your garden. I also noticed a pattern. Many of the most restrictive rules had been added in the last year through amendments. The original covenants were far more reasonable. As I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just rules. My grandfather had lived here peacefully for decades, and I'd visited hundreds of times as a boy. He'd never once mentioned an HOA, and I'd never seen a gate on that road before. I made a mental note to visit the county records office the first chance I got. Something else was bothering me too. While I was unpacking, I'd noticed a drone hovering over my property for a few minutes before zipping away toward the main subdivision. Little did I know that trying to follow Brenda's rules was like trying to navigate a maze designed by a sadist. The next morning, I woke up to find another citation emailed to me with a time-stamped photo attached. This time, Brenda had cited me for having unapproved wildflowers in my garden. My grandfather's perennial garden, which had been there for 40 years, apparently didn't meet the HOA's standard for cultivated landscapes. I spent the afternoon digging up daisies and black-eyed Susans, feeling like a criminal. By the time I finished, Brenda was walking toward my property again, tablet in hand, watching me with the smug satisfaction of a manager whose underling had finally complied a definite improvement. She said, making a note on her tablet, "However, I see your mailbox post is made of wood. Community standards updated in 2022 require all mailbox posts to be made of non-corrosive metal to ensure uniformity." I looked at my sturdy wooden post, which my grandfather had set in concrete himself, and then at the flimsy metal posts used throughout the rest of the neighborhood. Your grandfather's post was grandfathered in when the HOA was established, but the provision expired upon transfer of ownership. She explained, handing me another digitally printed citation. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 9 more citations. My porch swing was deemed a structural hazard. My fishing boat, parked on my own property, was an unauthorized vehicle. My driveway's gravel was not of the approved size and color. Each citation came with a fine between $75 and $300, and each one was delivered with a condescending lecture from Brenda. "I don't make these regulations to be difficult. Mr. Carter," she would say, "I spent my career in HR, and I know that clear policies create efficient and harmonious environments. Rules are what separate a community from a collection of random houses." What infuriated me most wasn't the fines, though my savings were dwindling fast. It was Brenda's corporate jargon and the way she treated me like an employee who needed performance management during one of her visits. I pointed out that her own decorative fountain seemed to violate a rule about water usage during a dry spell. Brenda's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. "Mr. Carter, as the president of this association, I am well aware of which rules are priorities and which are not. She made another note on her tablet, her stylus pressing hard against the screen. Speaking of priorities, your firewood is stacked in a manner visible from the access road. That's a violation of Section 14C. By the end of the third week, I'd paid over $3,500 in fines and had started to feel a constant sense of anxiety. Every time I stepped outside, I began researching property law and HOA regulations online, and what I found was both enlightening and infuriating. HOAs have a lot of power, but that power is not absolute. That's when I found something that made my heart beat a little faster. One of Brenda's citations referenced a bylaw about property setbacks, but when I cross-referenced it with the original county plat map, I found that the HOA's claimed boundary line was off by at least 20 feet. More importantly, the amendment that changed the setback rule had been passed just 4 months ago, and the process required a 60-day notification period for all affected property owners, and a 2/3 majority vote of the entire community. I started calling other residents to ask if they'd been notified. Most had no idea any rule changes had been made. I decided to attend the monthly HOA board meeting to address my concerns publicly. The meeting was held in a sterile community clubhouse that smelled like air freshener and resentment. About 20 people attended, mostly older residents who seemed resigned to Brenda's rule. When she opened the floor for resident issues, I stood up and politely laid out my situation. I explained that I wanted to be a good neighbor, but felt that some of the enforcement was excessive. For example, I said I was fined for a garden my grandfather planted before most of the houses here were even built. Brenda's response was swift and dismissive. She explained that upon transfer of ownership, all properties must be brought up to current community standards. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice projecting to the entire room, your grandfather was a valued member of this area for many years, but the community has evolved. The fact that you're finding it difficult to adapt to these new standards suggests you may not be a good fit for Whispering Pines. Several board members nodded in agreement, and I felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation. The message was clear: conform or get out. After the meeting, a young woman approached me in the parking lot. She introduced herself as Chloe, a college student home for the summer. That was brutal, she said quietly. Brenda's been on a power trip lately. I think she's trying to push people out so her friends can buy their properties. Chloe explained that several long-time residents had been hit with a wave of new fines and violations recently, but most just paid them to avoid a fight. It's easier to pay the fine than to fight the system, she said, but what she's doing to you feels different, like it's personal. As I drove home that night, I wondered what I'd done to become Brenda's special project. I was about to find out that my real problems were just beginning the morning after the HOA meeting. Gary Miller knocked on my door. Gary was a retired sales manager in his late 60s who served as the HOA's treasurer and lived in one of the newer houses near the community entrance. He had a friendly smile and seemed genuinely troubled by what had happened. Alex, he said, using my first name as if we were old buddies. I wanted to apologize for how that meeting went. Brenda can be a bit rigid, but her heart is in the right place. Gary suggested we get coffee and talk about how to smooth things over with the association. I've been on this board for 3 years, he said, "I know how to handle Brenda. Maybe I can help you get back in her good graces." We met at a local diner, and Gary listened with what seemed like genuine sympathy. As I explained my financial struggles, I told him about being laid off, about the dwindling severance pay, and how the cabin was my last resort while I looked for new work. Gary nodded understandingly and shared a story about his own career setbacks. "The thing about Brenda," he said, leaning forward as if sharing a secret, "is that she respects people who make an effort. If you show her you're trying to comply, she'll cut you some slack." He suggested I focus on the most visible violations first to demonstrate my commitment to being a part of the community. Gary's advice seemed practical, and I was relieved to finally have someone on my side. He offered to speak with Brenda personally and suggested a strategy of tackling one major issue at a time. "Fix the mailbox first," he said. "That's a big one for her show, how you're willing to play ball, and she'll ease up on the rest." We shook hands, and I felt a renewed sense of hope. Gary seemed like the reasonable voice I'd been looking for, even offered to lend me his post-hole digger to help with the mailbox project over the next week. I dedicated myself to compliance. I spent what little money I had left on a new metal mailbox post, replaced my grandfather's charming wooden one, and even painted my porch swing a pre-approved shade of beige. Gary stopped by once to check on my progress and offered words of encouragement. He seemed sincerely pleased with my efforts and assured me that Brenda had taken notice of my new cooperative attitude. She mentioned at the last board meeting that "you're finally starting to understand how things work around here," he told me. His praise gave me the motivation to keep going, even though the constant scrutiny made me feel like I was living under a microscope. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched more closely than ever. My neighbor's curtain seemed to twitch whenever I was outside, and I started noticing the same silver SUV driving slowly past my property. At odd hours, then the betrayal came while I was checking my bank balance one morning. I saw a new $500 fine from the HOA posted to my account. The violation was for unauthorized land alteration. During evening hours, the notice referenced a specific complaint about digging and noise after 8 p.m. The problem was, I hadn't done any digging in the evening. I'd been meticulous about following the rules, doing all my work during the day. The complaint was anonymous, but it included details about the type of tool I was using that could only have come from someone who was there. I called Gary, immediately explaining the situation and asking if he knew who could have made the complaint. There was a long pause before he answered. "Alex," he said, his voice suddenly cool and distant. "I think there might have been a misunderstanding. Maybe someone saw your tools out and assumed you were working late." But as he spoke, I remembered something. Gary had stopped by my cabin the previous evening. As I was putting my tools away, I'd mentioned to him that I planned to dig a new drainage trench the next day. I hadn't actually done the work, but I had talked about my plan while Gary was there. The complaint described exactly what I had told him I was going to do. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Gary had been feeding information to Brenda all along. His friendly advice, his offers of help, his encouraging words, it had all been a tactic to gather intelligence on me. The surveillance I felt wasn't paranoia after all. When I confronted him directly, Gary's response was chillingly unapologetic. "I'm sorry, Alex. he said flatly, "but I have to protect my own interests here. Brenda asked me to keep her informed, and I can't afford to make an enemy of her. You'll understand once you've been here longer." That afternoon, I tried talking to other neighbors, hoping to find someone willing to stand with me. But everywhere I went, I met a wall of polite fear. People would listen, nod sympathetically, then explain why they couldn't get involved. "Brenda has done a lot for our property values," one neighbor said. "I don't want to get on her bad side," said another. A few admitted privately that they thought the rules were insane, but none would dare say so publicly. The message was clear. I was completely alone in this fight as I sat in my cabin that evening, looking out at the lake my grandfather had cherished. I finally understood the true nature of the problem. This wasn't about rules or community standards. It was about power and the way one person's hunger for control could poison an entire community. Brenda had created a system where conformity was enforced not by consensus, but by fear and neighborly surveillance. I realized that no amount of compliance would ever be enough, because the rules weren't the point. The point was absolute submission to her authority. I had become a symbol, a public example of what happens to anyone who dares to question the Queen tomorrow. I would discover just how far Brenda was willing to go to maintain her throne. I woke up to the sound of a generator and power tools outside my cabin. Two construction workers were installing a heavy-duty chain-link fence across the bridge, effectively sealing off my only access to the main road. A large sign read, "Bridge closed for emergency structural assessment by order of the HOA." Brenda stood nearby, supervising the work, her arms crossed, and a smug look on her face when she saw me approaching. She held up a document printed on official-looking letterhead, "Mr. Carter." She announced, loud enough for the workers to hear, "Our independent safety consultant has deemed this bridge structurally unsound. For liability reasons, the board has voted to restrict all access until a full engineering report can be completed and necessary repairs are made." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. My cabin was now completely cut off, accessible only by a 4-mile hike through dense woods or by boat across the lake. I couldn't get my truck out for job interviews. I couldn't have groceries delivered. I couldn't even get mail without hiking to the community mailboxes within a day. My internet service, which relied on a line running along the bridge, went dead. A scheduled video interview for a promising surveying job was canceled after I couldn't connect. Another potential contract was lost when I couldn't drive to an in-person meeting. The physical strain was just as bad as a financial one. I was already stressed, and suddenly having to carry supplies and water 4 miles through the woods left me exhausted and demoralized. I lost 10 pounds in 2 weeks, not from healthy living, but from the sheer effort of surviving. What made it all the more infuriating was the lie that this was about safety. The bridge was a fortress my grandfather, a meticulous craftsman, had built it with railroad ties and steel I-beams. I'd helped him maintain it my whole life and knew it was solid. But Brenda's independent safety consultant turned out to be her brother-in-law, who ran a home inspection business, and their assessment had been a 5-minute visual glance from the shore. No structural engineer was ever consulted. No real tests were ever done when I pointed this out. Brenda lectured me about risk management and fiduciary responsibility. After a week of isolation, the community held an emergency board meeting to discuss my situation. I hiked in for the meeting, arriving sweaty and covered in mud. From the trail, the clubhouse was packed. It seemed the bridge drama had become the talk of the neighborhood. Brenda called the meeting to order and gave a long speech about her duty to protect the community from potential lawsuits and the importance of proactive safety measures. Several residents nodded along, seemingly convinced by her corporate speak. When Brenda opened the floor for discussion, I stood up and tried to present my side of the story. I explained the extreme hardship the closure was causing, pointed out the lack of a professional inspection, and suggested the timing was a blatant act of retaliation for my previous complaints. But as I spoke, I could feel my composure slipping, the exhaustion, the stress, the financial ruin, the feeling of being systematically dismantled. It all came pouring out. My voice got louder, my words more desperate, and I could see some residents shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I'm a person, not a policy violation to be managed into compliance. I finally yelled, "Are you running a community or a corporate cult?" The room fell into a stunned silence. I knew immediately I'd made a terrible mistake. My emotional outburst had just validated everything Brenda wanted them to believe about me. She waited a long beat, letting my words hang in the air, then responded with practiced calm. But just before she spoke, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not victory, but something else, something that looked like a deep-seated fear. Her hand fluttered to her necklace, an unconscious gesture of anxiety. Later, I would learn that Brenda had been fired from her last HR job after employees filed a formal complaint about her creating a hostile work environment. Her entire identity was built on being in control, and any challenge to that control was a threat to her very being. Mr. Carter clearly needs to work on his anger management and communication skills, she said smoothly. I think this outburst proves exactly why the board needs to maintain strict protocols for the safety and harmony of our community. Several residents nodded, and I saw my support evaporate as I gathered my things to begin the long hike back to my cabin. A few people offered quiet apologies, but their message was clear. They sympathized, but they wouldn't back someone who caused a scene that night. I called a real estate agent to discuss selling the cabin. I was defeated, ready to surrender, to let Brenda win. But as I sat in my grandfather's worn armchair, looking at the lake he loved, something snapped. This wasn't just about a bridge or an HOA anymore. This was about my grandfather's legacy, about the home he had poured his heart into, about the simple principle that you don't let a bully win just because they're louder and more ruthless. Someone had to stand up to her abuse of power. I decided to keep fighting, but I needed a weapon. The next morning, I would start looking for it in the one place I hadn't yet explored: my grandfather's old files stored in a dusty trunk in the back of the cabin's closet. Cleaning out my grandfather's personal effects had been on my to-do list, but I'd been too overwhelmed with Brenda's attacks to face it. Now facing the loss of the property, I finally opened the old leather trunk to sort through the remnants of a long life. The space smelled of cedar and old paper, filled with war medals, fishing lures, and faded photographs. As I worked my way through layers of his life, I felt a deep connection to the man I missed so dearly. In a side pocket of the trunk, tucked beneath a stack of old maps, I found a heavy canvas satchel tied with a leather cord. The satchel was surprisingly heavy. Inside was a collection of official documents that told the story of his life on this land, property, deeds tax assessments, permits for the septic system, and dozens of handwritten letters about his dream of building a cabin away from the noise of the world. In one letter from 1963, he wrote to my grandmother about his plans to build a permanent bridge across the creek, using his own savings to create a lasting legacy for our family. But the real prize was buried at the very bottom, a thick vellum envelope containing official correspondence between my grandfather and the County Road Commission. A letter dated August 10, 1964, showed my grandfather applying for a permit to construct a private bridge on his property. The county's response, dated September 5th, granted the permit on the condition that he would assume all responsibility for maintenance and pay a yearly bridge tax directly to the county. What followed was a stack of receipts showing 5 decades of payments for something called Carter Bridge, tax ID number 8821 payments, that had continued uninterrupted through the previous year. I sat on the floor of that dusty cabin, holding papers that felt like they were glowing. I had just unearthed a legal time bomb. My grandfather hadn't just built a bridge, he'd built a privately owned, legally registered, tax-paying bridge that had been under county jurisdiction for over 50 years. Every time I paid the annual property tax bill, I had unknowingly been paying the county's maintenance and registration fee for my own private bridge. The bridge wasn't community property in any sense of the word. It was my property, legally owned and maintained through official government channels. Since long before Whispering Pines was even a blueprint in a developer's office, I needed to be sure. So the next morning, I hiked into town and visited the county records office. Mr. Henderson, the retired assessor I'd spoken to earlier, happened to be there volunteering. "Oh, sure," Mr. Henderson said when I showed him the documents. "Your granddad was proud as a peacock of that bridge, built it to last forever. Paid his taxes on it like clockwork, never missed a year." Mr. Henderson pulled up the current records on the county computer and confirmed that the bridge tax was still active and being paid as part of my property's annual assessment. "As far as this county is concerned, that's your bridge, son," he said. "Always has been." Armed with this undeniable proof, I contacted Chloe, the college student who'd shown me support. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop, far from the prying eyes of the community. When I laid the documents out on the table, her eyes went wide. "Alex, this is a nuke," she whispered. "If you own the bridge, then the HOA has been trespassing on your property for years. Every single resident has been using your private property without permission. Brenda's safety committee has zero authority to close your bridge. They've committed a criminal offense by destroying your property and blocking your access." We spent the next hour strategizing with Chloe, taking pictures of every document and making notes on the legal angles. She pointed out that the original county permit detailed the bridge's exact specifications and load capacity information that proved Brenda's safety claims were a complete fabrication. "The best part," Chloe said with a grin, "is that your grandfather was clearly a man who planned for the worst. These documents are airtight." That evening, I called Mr. Henderson at home to ask more about the bridge's history. "Your granddad didn't trust committees or associations," Mr. Henderson said with a chuckle. "He always said, if you want to keep what's yours, you keep the paperwork to prove it. He built that bridge because he wanted to own his freedom never wanted to be at the mercy of a neighbor's whim to get to his own home. He paused, then added, I guess he knew that someday someone would try to take it from him. As I sat in my cabin that night, looking at the documents spread across my grandfather's old desk, I felt a profound connection to him. He hadn't just left me a piece of property, he'd left me a lesson in foresight and independence. The bridge was more than just a way to get to my cabin. It was a symbol of self-reliance and the principle that freedom isn't granted by a committee. It's built by individuals willing to do the work tomorrow. I would call Brenda Reynolds and inform her that we needed to have a discussion about the bridge she was about to learn, that my grandfather had outsmarted her entire association from 50 years in the past. I called Brenda at 9 a.m. sharp, using the same calm, professional tone she'd always used on me. Brenda, this is Alex Carter. We need to discuss the bridge. I've uncovered some information that fundamentally changes the situation. There was a brief silence before she responded, her voice dripping with that familiar HR condescension. Mr. Carter, if this is another emotional appeal regarding our safety protocols, I can assure you the board's decision is firm. We will not expose the community to legal liability just to suit your personal agenda. I let her finish her little speech, then delivered the line I had been rehearsing all morning. Brenda, I own that bridge. I have the original deed the county permits, and 50 years of tax records. We need to talk. The silence that followed was longer and more satisfying than I could have imagined. When Brenda finally spoke, her voice had lost its confident edge. That's not possible. Mr. Carter, the bridge provides community access and has been maintained by the HOA for years. I could hear the faint sound of her frantically tapping on her tablet, probably searching her digital files for something to refute my claim. I suggest you bring your alleged documents to tonight's emergency board meeting so our legal counsel can review them. I'm certain this is just a simple misunderstanding. But the tremor in her voice told me she was deeply worried about what those documents might reveal. That evening, the community clubhouse was standing room only. Word had spread like wildfire that the bridge ownership was being challenged, and every resident had turned out to witness the showdown. I arrived with a binder full of laminated documents and Chloe as my tech support, ready to project the evidence onto a large screen. Brenda entered with Gary Miller and 2 other board members carrying a box of HOA files. She'd also brought a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as the association's attorney. Brenda called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a prepared monologue about property lines, community assets, and the legal dangers of baseless claims. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, we are here tonight because Mr. Carter has made some rather fantastic claims regarding ownership of the bridge. I want to assure you that the HOA has meticulously maintained records of all community property, and we will not be intimidated by frivolous threats. She gestured toward her attorney as if he were a secret weapon. Several residents nodded, apparently swayed by her confident delivery. When Brenda finished, I calmly stood up and requested permission to present my findings. I started with the original county permit from 1964, passing copies around the room so everyone could see the official county seal and signatures. I explained how my grandfather had built the bridge himself obtained all necessary permits, and paid a dedicated bridge tax for over 50 years. This isn't a threat, I said, making eye contact with as many residents as I could. This is a fact. I have been paying county taxes on this specific bridge every year since I inherited this property. The county assessor's office confirms that Carter Bridge Tax ID 8821 is my private property. The atmosphere in the room began to shift as people examined the papers. These weren't ambiguous printouts. They were official government documents with raised seals and an unbroken chain of title going back decades. People started whispering to each other, and I could see doubt spreading across their faces. Brenda's attorney asked to see the originals, and after a few minutes of careful inspection, he leaned over and whispered something to Brenda that made her face go white. "These documents appear to be in order," he said grudgingly, "but there could be issues of prescriptive easement that affect community access rights." That's when Mr. Henderson stood up from the back of the room. I'd asked him to attend as an expert witness, and his presence as a respected former county official carried immense weight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Henderson said in his steady voice, "I've known Alex's grandfather since I started working for the county in 1970, and I've processed the tax payments on that bridge for 30 years. There is no ambiguity here. Alex Carter owns that bridge free and clear, just like his grandfather did. Everyone in this room has been crossing private property every time you've used that bridge, and the owner has been gracious enough to let you do so without complaint." He looked directly at Brenda. "Until now." The legal reality began to sink in around the room. If I owned the bridge, then the HOA had no right to close it. Even more critically, if residents had been using my private land for years without a formal agreement, I could potentially restrict access or charge a toll. The community attorney tried to argue about implied easements, but Mr. Henderson shut him down. Easements require formal legal agreements. Simply allowing neighbors to use your land out of courtesy does not grant them permanent rights to it. Brenda made one last desperate attempt to seize control, standing up with her tablet and launching into a speech about established community protocols. Even if these documents are valid, she stammered, "This community has established procedures for major changes. Mr. Carter cannot unilaterally disrupt decades of established access without a formal review process." But her voice was weak, and several residents were already getting up to leave. Gary Miller tried to suggest forming a committee to study the issue, but the crowd was already dispersing as the meeting fell apart. Brenda approached me, her face a mixture of disbelief and something I'd never seen before, fear for the first time. She looked no